Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Wilson, and I am the Assistant Director of the Povich Center. I wanted to thank you all very much for being here today so we can honor John, celebrate this honor and with his family. We're very excited. Just before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know that we are recording this so that we can have the video later. So thank you very much, and I am going to kick things over to Mark.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. Well, welcome everyone to our Merrill College students, our alumni, friends of the Povich Center, and the Smallwood family. Thanks for joining us this morning as we honor John with the 2021 Lacy-Smith Award. There are a few special guests on the Zoom this morning that I'd like to recognize by name. And that begins with the Smallwood family. First, Ryan Smallwood, John and Yvette's daughter, who I understand is joining us actually from her high school. So great, happy to have you, Ryan. John's parents, John Smallwood Sr. and Jacqueline Smallwood, and John's sisters, Pamela Candelaria and Gina Simpson. We're so pleased that you're all able to join us. Lynn and Maury Povich, thank you for everything you do for the Povich Center, and particularly for your support of the center's initiatives touching diversity and inclusion. And we'll hear from Maury in a moment. George Solomon, founding director of the Povich Center. We're here today because of you, George. In 2015, you created the Lacy-Smith Award. Thank you, George. Professor Kevin Blackystone, my friend and colleague, who elevates everything that happens at the Povich Center, and members of this year's Lacy-Smith Selection Committee, Roxana Scott, Monica McNutt, David Steele, and the chair, Nick Petruskowitz. Thank you all. And finally, so many of John's newspaper friends who have joined us today, really too many to mention, but they include my longtime friends, Pat McClune, the former managing editor of sports for the Inquirer, and the great Ray Didinger, the longtime sports columnist for the Philadelphia Bulletin and Daily News. So thank you all for coming. Now I'd like to introduce the Dean of Merrill College, Lucy Dalglish.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everyone to Merrill College. I'm getting a little sign, pardon me, I'm getting little things popping up in my face here. I think everything is set. Welcome to Philip Merrill College of Journalism. I am in Knight Hall on campus today. Very few other people are, but we are getting through the pandemic the best way that we can. And I'm just thrilled that you could all join us. Every year, it is such an honor to recognize and commemorate Sam Lacy and Wendell Smith and the legacy that they have left us and in promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in the sports journalism world. George Solomon created this award in 2015, and we have had several incredible award winners. And we're so proud that this year we're able to honor one of our own, John Smallwood, from the class of 1987. And I know several of his classmates are here with us. John was taken from us much too early last December. I'd just like to remind everyone that diversity, equity, and inclusion is part of an ongoing conversation that we are having in our communities, on campus, and around the world. But this effort would have been, I think, very, very important to Shirley Povich, who was a great promoter of recognition and opportunities for sports journalists of color. And those of you who were able to see the inauguration of our new president, President Darryl Pines, know that issues of diversity, equity, inclusion are really #1 on his agenda for probably the next decade. So thank you all for joining us today, and I'm going to give it back to Mark Hyman so that we can learn more about the incredible career of John Smallwood.
Great. Thank you so much, Lucy. Next is our friend Maury Povich. So Maury, if you can hear me, you're next.
Let me see, unmute. I hope everybody can hear me. All right. I want to thank you very much, Mark, for including us. My sister Lynn and my brother David are so grateful for what George did many years ago, his vision to inaugurate the Lacy-Smith Award. This award really is a cornerstone of the center in terms of its commitment to understanding what sports journalism encompasses. And the recipients have been so worthy so far of this award, including, of course, the deserving John Smallwood. Just a brief personal note. I know of John's writing. I spent two parts of my life in Philadelphia, first as a student at the University of Pennsylvania, and then as a talk show host and anchorman at Channel 3 KYW in the 1980s. And I know how Philadelphia sports fans wear their emotions on their sleeves. And John tapped into that so well for so long, and as well as his colleagues. As far as Sam Lacy and Wendell Smith, I did not know Wendell Smith. I don't know if my father knew Wendell. They probably did at very big events during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, 70s for that matter. But since he was working out of Pittsburgh and my father was an American leaguer in Washington, I don't know how their paths crossed. But when it comes to Sam Lacy, my father felt Sam was a great colleague. And I knew of Sam and knew him well because I covered sports in Washington from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So I would see Sam at events. And of course, the very interesting story about my father and Sam occurred during World War II in the 1940s, when they were having a big bound rally in Washington, D.C., and they were putting this by having Joe Louis and Max Baer fight in an exhibition fight at Griffith Stadium, then the baseball stadium in Washington. And you have to understand, back then the stadium was segregated. The Black population had to sit in one area alone. And so with the fight, my father's walking in and Sam is walking in. They see each other, they greet each other, and then all of a sudden Sam says, "I'll see you, Shirley, later." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "Well, they put me up in the rafters somewhere." And Dad said, "That's not going to happen." And so he brought Sam Lacy in to fight the press row, first row in the outside the ring, and Sam integrated boxing when it came to the press on that day in 1944. So we are so familiar what this award means. It's very important for the center, and I think Dad would be so honored that John Smallwood enters this ring of very deserving people. Thanks very much, Mark.
Maury, thank you. Next, Nick Petruskowitz, who is, he's serving double duty for the Povich Center. Nick is the chair of our Povich Center Advisory Board, and he was also the chair of the Lacy-Smith Selection Committee. So we're very grateful to Nick, and I will turn things over to him.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. I was honored to be part of this group surrounded by such great and thoughtful journalists like David Steele and Roxana Scott and Monica McNutt, and of course you, Mark. Being in a virtual room with such an impressive group of people, so passionate about this business and the responsibility that was put in our hands it felt good. And it comes at a time when we could all use something to feel good about. While we discussed a tremendous list of names, John Smallwood always came across to us as the most obvious and the most worthy choice. So I will say that while we spent quite a bit of time on this, the choice was pretty easy. One personal note is I grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So I am a child of Northeastern Pennsylvania, raised in a house that lived and breathed the Eagles and the Phillies. My father was a diehard fan. Had he still been with us, I'm pretty sure I would have sent John's final tweet, which was "The Eagles are embarrassing," to my father, just to point it out to him. I am very familiar with John's work. I never, however, had the great pleasure of crossing paths with him, or at least knowingly in press boxes. But I do have a friend and former colleague, Dana O'Neill, who has spent an entire career in Philadelphia, who is a great journalist for The Athletic. And so I reached out to her this week and said, "Tell me about John Smallwood." And her response was, "I didn't know John, I loved John." He walked into a press room and didn't just ask about her kids. He asked how Kieran and Madigan were doing. He knew names. He got to know people. The details were important. And she could not stress enough. I said, "Tell me one story," and she told me about 15. That is the kind of person he was, and on top of clearly a great journalist. So again, I am so happy to have been a part of this group. And I cannot thank David, Monica, Roxana, and Mark for all their time through this. This was an incredibly rewarding experience for me, and I appreciate just being a part of it.
Thank you, Nick. David Steele, you are next. And David, I have a special place in my heart. I think we all do, for David Steele, who, of course, is an alum of the University of Maryland, is such a friend to Merrill College and the Povich Center. We have called on David many times over the years, and he has unfailingly responded. And David and John Smallwood were contemporaries at Maryland. So David has seen John's ascension as a sports writer over many years, and so honored that David is here and has agreed to speak about John.
There I am. Thank you so much. You know, public speaking is not really my thing. Writing is really what I like doing more. And the funny thing is, that's one of those things that sort of made me envious about John, because he felt so comfortable being on air and doing a show like the one he did in Philly for so many years with the Daily News. And yeah, I think it was just because he was so comfortable, you know, being himself and talking about the things that were really, really important to him. And that's one of the reasons it's such an honor for me to have an opportunity to talk about him and his life and his legacy and where he came from for this ceremony. And I'm so glad we got a chance to talk to that Maury got a chance to speak and tell his story about Sam Lacy, because I know that would be something that John would be really, really proud of, being here from this area and being honored with an award named after somebody of the magnitude of Sam Lacy, who cleared a path for all of us, and whose footsteps we all tried to follow. You know, his story was one that we passed along, you know, that we told about even way back in the very beginning when we were undergrads in Maryland, talking about, you know, what do you do as a young Black sports writer? Is there a path for us? Is there a way for us? Is there a place for us in this business? And we said, yeah, of course there is, because look at what Sam Lacy did right here at the Afro. So I know how important that would be for him. It was tremendous knowing him as a friend only. I wishing I had more time to talk to him and take more time to be around him in his latter days. He's just such a phenomenal person to be around as a colleague, and I've had a chance to tell stories about the places that we had a chance to be and cover places, arenas and stadiums and press conferences and events and tournaments around here, but also, here in this area, up in Philly, different places during the NCAA tournament, during the NBA playoffs so many times. And 21 years ago now, where we just sort of reveled in the fact that look at where we are and look at where we've come. And I think that what really sort of moved me most about all this is where we did come from, because we met here on campus as students and in the College of Journalism, but as staff members at the Black Explosion. And those of you who, if you're not familiar with it, it's the bi-weekly Black newspaper here on campus. It underwent a name change several years ago. It became the Eclipse, and then another newspaper came along called the Black Explosion, sort of continued the legacy. So just kind of, but when we were there together, we sort of came there the same way in different years, just going up to the little office in the dining hall, wanting to write sports, but also wanting to write about us in sports and being present in the sports landscape at a very young age as journalists. And it meant everything to us, and it really sort of groomed what we wanted to be. And I don't know how many of the Black Explosion alumni here on this call, I know that they were just heartbroken when John passed, and I know they're thrilled that that he's getting this award now, but I'm not one to speak on their behalf, but I know that the people like Vanessa Williams and Greg Wright and Deborah Barfield and Gary Graves and Keisha Hansard, and there are just so many of us from those days who have taken what we learned and taken the camaraderie that we all had and taken it into this profession, tried to represent it well, tried to do it the way that it should be done, and tried to extend what we learned in the world. And I'm grateful for them. I'm thankful for them. I'm thankful for what they provided. And John is really, maybe the greatest example of what they were able to provide for him. To know that this award, he's the first alumnus to receive this award, and the first of us to get this award was somebody who wrote for the Black Explosion. So thank you again, and I'm so proud. I'm so glad to see the Smallwood family here, and thank you again.
Thank you, David. Well, excuse me, before we hear from Yvette, which I think we're all eager to do, we have a short video, a tribute video to John that we would like to share. So I'm going to ask Caitlin if she can cue that up.
Yes, I am getting started here. Please let me know if you cannot hear it as it begins. Could you hear that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Here we go.
The possibilities and the potential to really speak to larger issues through sports is tremendous. The mission of the Povich Center, I think, reflects an understanding that sports are not just about scores and statistics.
We focus on sports journalism, but not just the sports, also the intersection of sports, culture, and society.
Sports reporting for people of color and marginalized people is critical.
The Povich Center definitely helps students consider the lens of sports, the opportunities that are sports specific, but also how sports reflect society at large.
The Lacy-Smith Award is one to celebrate in perpetuity the great work and the important work of two pioneer sports journalists, Wendell Smith and Sam Lacy, who were voices heard beyond the sports page.
They were told in those certain terms over and over and over and over again that they did not belong, that nobody had any reason or right to have to listen to them, to read them, to see them. If they could have been made invisible by the powers that be at the time, they would have.
it's important that they be recognized and held up as examples for what Povich Center wants to do in terms of producing the next generation of sports journalists.
It's an award that reflects a social conscience. And Sam Lacy and Wendell Smith are the personification of that commitment, as was Shirley Povich. And to be able to honor John Smallwood with an award in their name is powerful stuff.
He left people thinking differently about sports and the people who play them, and the people who participate in them, and people who invest their time and their emotions and their resources into it.
The Lacy Smith Award to me is so powerful because it stamps that the work that you're doing has a big picture impact that is far beyond the scores.
John was never afraid to, poke at the people and the things and the institutions and the traditions and the sort of things that were sort of allowed to stand that people sort of took for granted, that people thought were untouchable. If he didn't feel they were untouchable, then he was not going to treat them as untouchables. Anytime you're really doing this job well, you're really telling a story about everything that's going on around you and the people that are making it happen.
Shirley Povich, the sports columnist, was witty, urbane, and insightful. But what defined him in his journalism was his commitment to social justice. He worked for the Washington Post for 75 years, and for much of that time, he was writing about inequality and exclusion like very few others in the mainstream media. I know that Shirley Povich would be quite proud of the Povich Center for honoring John Smallwood.
Well, it's time to hear from Yvette Smallwood, and I know I'm very much looking forward to that. So Yvette, it's your turn.
First, I'd like to say thank you to the University of Maryland, the Philip Merrill College of Journalism, Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism, and the Lacy Smith Award Selection Committee. John would be so honored and so grateful for this recognition. He'd be honored that you think of his work as continuing the legacies of Sam Lacy and Wendell Smith, and that you think of him in the same light as the previous awardees. If John were here, he'd be able to say something, really witty in his remarks, because that's kind of the person that he was. Although he probably wouldn't use the term witty, that's more my term. But I unfortunately do not have the same gift that he had for speaking. Many of you have probably heard the story told by a lot of parents about how when they were younger and they would have to walk really far to school in the snow or the rain and uphill both directions. And John would not have quite the same type of story to tell, but he definitely had the ability to capture and hold people's attention and make them laugh. That's one thing I can say about him, that he was definitely one to be able to, to be in a room and be able to speak to anyone, and everybody loved to speak to him. In his writing, he always wanted to make someone smile, but also to think, sometimes to think harder about themselves, about others, about how their thoughts, actions, or inaction affected other people's lives. He also wanted his readers to feel something about after reading his columns, whether that meant agreeing with him or disagreeing with him, or sometimes declaring that he was completely wrong about whatever he said, as many people online feel a need to say, although I'm sure for many of the writers online on the call now, people are not don't say things in such nice terms online when they disagree with what you've written. But whatever, people's reactions were, he always appreciated the fact that readers felt so impassioned about his writing to actually comment about it. And he always felt that it was his duty to respond to the readers. Sometimes he would read to me some of the comments that he received, and I would ask him, why he would be responding when people were sometimes really rude in terms of what they said and how they said it. But he typically chose not to be too selective. He said if a reader took the time to write a comment to him, that he wanted to be able to write back and, engage with them, whether that was, explaining, why he said what he said, often trying to understand the other person's point of view. But he always liked to engage with people, whether that was in person, in his writing, online. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you to everyone who's supported him over the years, his family, his friends, the Philadelphia Inquirer and Daily News, his coworkers, the former papers that he worked for, as well as to those that took the time to read his columns and other stories over the years. I know that John is listening and smiling right now, his big, wide smile that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So thank you.
Thank you, Yvette. We're going to show you a picture of the trophy that goes along with this award. That's quite special, and that has been given to all of the previous award winners. And again, we want to thank the Smallwood family so much for all of the assistance that they've given us, and tell you how much it means to us to honor John Smallwood. Merrill College is fortunate to have some really exceptional alums, and John Smallwood is an exceptional alum, and we're pleased and honored to be able to honor him and put him in this special class of Lacy-Smith Award winners. So thank you all.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Thank Smallwood family. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvette.